Welcome back to the Health Bridge. Dr. Pedram Shojai here with my co-hostess for the day, Dr. Tammy Morelia. Hi, Tammy.
Hey.
So I'm surrounded by OB-GYN genius hormone wisdom today, because we are tethered in to Dr. Maish, who's up in Massachusetts area, sitting in some Harvard ivory tower, if you will. So top of the food chain wisdom, all about women's health and hormonal health. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see both of you, two good friends, two very knowledgeable people, and really a pleasure to be part of it.
Hey, this is going to be great. I feel like I'm going to learn something today. You had a quote that you had mentioned to me, Maish, when we spoke last, and I thought it was great because you said men are the sun and women are the moon, and that the journey of menopause starts very differently at different eras. And so between the two of you guys, I'm just so excited to learn about this, because menopause is obviously a big deal. Women's hormones are always going to be a subject, because functionally we all have certain issues going on.
Well, let me comment about that, because that's a yogic quote, and it comes from a book that I did with Hari Karkalsa a few years ago called A Woman's Book of Yoga. And what it says is that women are basically so dependent on hormones that are constantly changing that they're like the moon, the phases of the moon. And in fact, the yoga perspective, and it's not me personally speaking here, it's the yoga perspective, is if you're not satisfied with the mood that you see, wait 2.5 days and it'll change, because hormones are always changing. So men are more like the sun because it's more of a constant flow. And that's where that originates from a yoga point of view.
And I think that not only the month has different perspectives for your hormones, but different decades of our lives. You know, what we are dealing with when we're going from the age of 10 to 15 is completely different from 50 to 55. And so that's a really great way of looking at it. Can you kind of give us an overview of this sort of journey of hormones and then break it up into the different parts for us?
Sure. You know, hormones are going through a complete life cycle, just like women go through a complete life cycle. And they start off at birth at a very, very low level. The main hormones that we'll talk about here are estrogen and progesterone, because those are the two most involved. And those two hormones at birth are incredibly low. There's not much going on at that time in terms of estrogen until about the time of puberty. And then at the time of puberty, those hormones begin to awaken and they start to get synchronized with each other. At first it's very erratic, and most people can think back and remember about all of the mood swings that they had and the changes their body was going through as their breasts start to develop and they started to get curves on their body, all of that under the influence of hormones, estrogen and progesterone mostly, and then over the next years as they reach reproduction, those hormones get very synchronized. And it turns out that estrogen, which is constant most of the time, it's cycling, but it's usually at higher levels, and progesterone every 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks of the month, these hormones get like paired figure skaters. They're synchronized to each other, they're dependable, and of course if you don't get pregnant at the end of a month, you end up having a period and the whole lining of the uterus sheds and the whole cycle starts over again. And that continues for a window of time until about 35 years or so, until the time of perimenopause, or that window transitioning into the menopause, in which point hormones get amazingly like puberty, only backwards. They start to go through those same irregular kinds of unsynchronized release. And then what ends up happening is moods start to change again, skin starts to change again, curves and body parts start to change again, until finally estrogen and progesterone levels eventually drift downward to very low levels, which is when menopause comes. So you've got something that looks like the Dow Jones going in a downward direction through the last part of reproduction, but trending in a downward way. So that's a very quick thumbnail overview. And so, but hormonally pretty accurate.
Well, and you know, I think it's even extra crazy, and I can speak to that myself, is that some of us have had children later. That's the trend nowadays. And so now, you have yourself experiencing that chaotic exit of hormones while your daughters are in the entry of hormones, and it makes for a chaotic husband household.
I was going to say, that poor guy is running.
I know.
We live in interesting times. But the thing about it is that's important to talk about here is that I want to talk a little bit just briefly about ages of things, because a lot of women think that menopause is for old women, and it's something that happens to women that are well in their 50s or 60s or sometime way in the future. But as many as 10% of women actually go into menopause before age 45. That's like 1 in 10. And 1 in 100 goes into menopause before age 40. And 1 in 1,000 goes into menopause before age 30. And 1 in 10,000 goes into menopause before age 20. So you've got menopause actually impacting on small parts of the population, but significant parts at particularly early and vulnerable times. And that impacts because the transition, the part that I talked about, like puberty coming forward or puberty going backwards, that happens as much as up to 10 years before menopause. So if you have someone that's going to go into menopause, sort of an early menopause before 45, or premature menopause, as it's called, before age 40, you're talking about somebody who's going to start having symptoms up to 10 years before that. So a woman in her 30s who finds that she's suddenly having moodiness, or her periods are getting kind of wonky, or she's having problems with palpitations in her chest, or she's not sleeping well, or her libido is going down, or her waistline is getting bigger, or some of these symptoms that are so confusing and worrisome could be transitioning into menopause. And women just need to be aware of that.
Yeah, and some of the symptoms of this hormone 10-year disruption can look like depression and insomnia. And you don't necessarily need an antidepressant or a sleeping pill. You could turn to somebody who has knowledge and the openness to listen, like you do in your practice when you were seeing patients and that you teach. It could be hormones.
It's interesting to me that there seems to be this like Goldilocks zone of fertility. And so, the hormones are trying to come into balance. They finally come into balance. And you have this time where like nature wants you to make babies, and we're trying to stretch that time. We're trying to prevent it on the front end and stretch it on the back end, because now we have all these careers and stuff. And then all of a sudden the balance is lost, and then we have to kind of readjust. I'm curious because, like, I'll sit on this side of the fence as kind of like the natural medicine guy at the table over here and say, so how much of this needs to be manipulated with the use of hormones, and how much of this can be altered with diet, lifestyle, modifications, stuff of that sort, before we have to resort to hormonal supplementation, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just, we got to suck it up and do that.
Well, and you can't put all hormones together either. So Maish?
I'm glad you raised that, because I have a new book coming out, I think you might know. It's called The Estrogen Window. It's going to come out April of 2016. That talks about the importance of timing and the importance of when you take estrogen. But right parallel with it is that there is so much that can be done with lifestyle. And it doesn't even matter if you take hormones. Hormone is just a cornerstone of treatment, even if you choose to do it. Because if you don't support all of you, the sum of you instead of some of you, then you're not going to have the opportunity to be as healthy and well as you can. So it's essential that you take into account sleep. The 4 pillars, I think, it's sleep, nutrition, exercise, and stress reduction, because these are the things that age us. These are the things that make things worse. And then you add to that the emotional pillars that are essential to somebody whether they're male or female, but self-esteem, the sense of having socialization, the importance of having a sense of purpose, all the things that matter. And all of those tie into how impacted we're going to be by our hormones. And of course, hormones are going to play an important role, as we can talk about later, in terms of risk for breast cancer or reducing the risk of breast cancer, which they can do, dementia, heart disease, osteoporosis, sex drive, and a whole lot more.
So I love that. I love that you talk about how you have to work on all of you, even if you're taking hormones, you know, even down to the receptors. Yeah, the receptors are more sensitive if you're in a healthier body to the hormones that you take, and maybe you don't need to take as much or whatever it is. So that's a very holistic approach. I love that.
Well, for instance, if you do exercise, like for instance, some women will not be able or just personally don't want to take hormones, which is fine. But if they don't and they exercise, they can do still a lot to control their waistline size. They can still lose waistline size and they can still build their muscles. But it's interesting that the combination of estrogen plus the exercise will put less fat in your muscles and more of the lean muscle fiber into it. So there is an impact, but it's all affected by by inclusion of lifestyle. Very, very, very important, because you can't just take a pill or a patch or whatever it is. There's no potion for life. You have to have healthy, sustainable habits. And I very much like to reinforce that with women all the time, because it's going to improve the quality of their life. But we can talk about any one of these, or we can talk about the hormones per se, however you wish to move forward.
Yeah, I think I'd like to maybe parse it out. Like, so if I'm a woman in my 20s, what do I need to look at? And then let's just kind of tease down per decade, because I think that perspective is very unique in our ability to kind of understand where we are, not me, but where a female would be on that spectrum.
Well, of course, the 20s for most women is a time of peak life. It's a time of peak fertility. It's kind of when the fine-tuning of everything is at its optimum. Now, what happens is that in most women, they're going to have fairly regular periods with very balanced hormones, and that's going to be fantastic. The issue is that we have to keep in mind certain things that can make that not the case. For instance, if your weight gets too thin or too fat, either extreme of weight has a big impact on hormones. And there's a lot of pressure on young women to look thin and try to fit a certain mold. And when they do, they risk having lower estrogen levels. When that happens, that can lead to fatigue and depression and irregular periods or absent periods and a whole host of things. Once again, nutrition. If women aren't eating well and healthy in their 20s and they want to really make sure they can fit into the dress and make it be just right, or particularly in summer when everybody wants to look great in their progressively smaller and smaller bathing suits, then what ends up happening there is that they can actually cause themselves harm, because they reduce the amount of estrogen produced by their body and are in essence exposing themselves to lower libido, greater risk for heart disease, and a whole host of other things. So nature on its own, if you maintain your weight and you eat healthy, you sleep, you exercise, things are pretty balanced in the 20s. It's a great time of life, and also when you're most able and most quickly able to get pregnant. So I think that's the most important part to talk about.
Can I ask a quick question about this? Is one of the things that I saw a lot clinically back when I did that was women coming in their 30s who spent their entire decade of their 20s on the pill. And then there was a lot of infertility and a lot of challenges there. I'd love to see what you guys have to say about that. Maish, how about start with you?
Well, I don't think the pill per se contributes to infertility, but what it does is the following. Many times when a young woman goes on the pill, and they may have started on the pill when they're 18 or maybe before, a lot of times it's because they become sexually active, but a lot of times it's because their periods are irregular, or maybe they've got acne and they're taking pills for the birth control pill to regulate them so that their skin will look better. And a lot of times what happens is 10 years later when they come off the pill, many of them forgot how irregular they were 10 years ago, was a long time ago. The other thing is that over the course of a decade, bodies change. And so someone who may have been a pretty skinny 20-year-old may be a not so skinny 30 or 32-year-old. So bodies change. And personal habits change, amounts of exercise, what you eat, and so forth. So, and also, young people are under a lot of stress. They have a lot of pressures on them. And sometimes moods and things that happen externally impact on a person's life. So there's a lot that happens. I don't think the pill per se is a negative for getting pregnant. But I do think that many things happen in the window that they're on the pill. Dr. Tammy, you may have a different opinion, but those are my thoughts.
No, I think I agree with all of those things. I think the one thing that I see over and over again in my clinic with women who are on the pill for whatever reason at whatever age is that their sex hormone binding globulin levels go up. And this is a carrier protein that carries their own estrogen. And it lasts a long time. So it's kind of like if you think of your hormone estrogen as a band and you're at the concert hall and you want the concert, you got to get the band off the bus, and the sex hormone binding globulin is the bus. So when you stop the pill, it takes some time until the sex hormone binding globulin goes down and the estrogen can get off those carrier proteins and actually help you get pregnant. And so I think that's why they have in the insert, it can be about 6 months till things get back to normal.
That's interesting.
Agreed. I mean, the pill can also lower that same binding globulin. It's sex hormone, so it's not only estrogen but testosterone, and it can lower testosterone. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why some young women really have very low libidos when they're on the pill, because the pill increases proteins, the sex hormone binding protein. The sex hormone binding globulin is a protein that lowers the amount of available testosterone and estrogen in the bloodstream. So it's been made, but it's kind of in a warehouse or on a bus, as you say. Doesn't make it available to get out and
there's no concert.
Do its things. There's no concert. As a matter of fact, there's no music being made here. So I see what you mean, and it's well put. Yeah. And it's totally accurate.
I have one more question about the 20s. I think that, at any decade of life, I think that there's a usual suspect of hormone that is more likely than not to be deficient or wonky doodle, as I say. And what are your thoughts about progesterone and, finding infertility and miscarriages and things? Is that the usual hormone that is found earlier to be out of whack, so to speak?
Well, progesterone being low, the first half of the cycle is when the egg is maturing. That's called the follicle or follicular phase, because the egg is surrounded by a little cyst called the follicle. And at the time of the egg's release, that follicle turns into something called a corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is basically wherein progesterone is made, and what used to be primarily an estrogen-producing follicle starts to make progesterone and estrogen. So that's the second half of the cycle. So what happens is, in some women, about 3 to 5% of fertility issues, the corpus luteum in the second half of the cycle doesn't make enough progesterone to support the uterine lining. So as a real cause of fertility, it's probably between 3 and 5% probably would be tops. And in that case, a little bit of progesterone in the second half of the cycle will resolve the problem, or sometimes in the first half of the cycle, some stimulating kind of medication, maybe clomiphene or low dosages of other hormones will be given to make a better first half of the cycle, so that the second half of the cycle indirectly is impacted. But progesterone can play a very important role, because after all, progesterone is progestation. That's what the word came from. And its progestational role is to make the lining of the uterus compact down and receptive to a fertilized egg implanting there. That's its whole job. And if that fails, the lining sheds, the progesterone stops, and everything starts all over again. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Love it. So now let's fast forward a decade. Now we're talking about someone in
You're
their 30s.
aging me so fast.
I know, totally. That's what happens when you have kids. So 30s to 40s. What's this snapshot? What's the difference?
As I indicated earlier, there are more women that realize it beginning to transition from their peak of fertility into the end of their fertile years. And so what ends up happening there is the highly synchronized estrogen and progesterone start to become a little unraveled, and things can get a little bit wonky, as you said, towards particularly in the second half of the decade. So usually after about 35, 36, things become more likely to be affected than they were earlier on. So it's basically cycles may start to change in length a little bit. There may be a little bit of difference in the pattern of bleeding, but for many women, they will not appreciate that something is really that different. But there are differences, and that's why as women get towards 36, 37, and particularly 38, the menstrual cycle starts to get suboptimized in terms of the fine-tuning of it, and fertility levels actually do drop at that point in time. So women have to really be aware that it isn't an open-ended book. And one of the downfalls of technology, because we have in vitro fertilization and we have all these other techniques, which many years ago I did the third one in the country. I did in vitro fertilization very early in the history of it. And what happens now is there's a presumption that technology can get me pregnant. Well, you're going to be right a lot of the time, but if you want guarantees, that's not the place to put it. What you get is a guarantee of the best opportunity in the history of the world. And it may happen, but not with certainty. So if you're a person who is trying to really get your family going, I really encourage you by the time you're 35 to be at least engaged in trying, because it may not happen. And the unkindness of it is that the older you get, when you have less time to get pregnant, the longer it takes to get pregnant. The number of months increases as you hit 35 and beyond for the average woman. So it's very important to be mindful of that so that you don't find yourself having to go see a fertility specialist and not being able to let nature take its course.
I think also after the age of 35, you get that horrible stamp of when you're pregnant being advanced medical age, AMA, and the reality is you are at risk for some other side effects. It just does get harder when you get older.
Right. You have increased risk of high blood pressure in pregnancy, or the placenta separating, or diabetes or other conditions that come along. So there are a number of medical issues that do happen as a woman ages. And when we talk about aging, remember the peak fertility for men and women is sometime around 19 or 20. I mean, that's when we're at our peak, maybe 22. Mm-hmm. That's kind of sad to think about, right? But that doesn't mean you can't get pregnant, because at the other extreme, there's always somebody that comes in my office at 50 and has what I call an oops baby, you know. So there's going to be happenings when people don't want it. It's like they've had 3 or 4 and they just weren't counting on that. That can't be possible. I don't know what happened to my periods. They're gone. Well, they've gone to your belly. That's where they are. So, it works both ways, unfortunately. So you have to be mindful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the name of the game here. and so now I want to talk about this kind of next window, because, mindful meets kind of out of your mind in some ways, and a lot of people have so many problems here with the symptoms that come with it, right? With the hot flashes and just kind of the mood swings and all the things that kind of are very disruptive to someone's life, and that's from 40 through menopause and then and beyond. So what are we seeing? And later on we'll move into like how can we kind of take the edge off this and nuance it. But what are you seeing from 40 through menopause?
Well, at that window of time, that's a very challenging time, because what happens is the fluctuations of hormones really do affect all parts of the body. Many people think that the hormones only affect maybe their breasts because they know that there may be some risk of breast cancer they've heard or something. So they know breasts are involved and pelvic organs are involved. But your brain is very involved. Estrogen is incredibly important in dilating blood vessels and bringing in lots of oxygen to your brain. It's very involved in the transmission of signals in our brain, how fast we physically react, how fast we're able to think and respond. All of the things that we take as thought, motor, mood, all of those are estrogen impacted. So when you start to have estrogen levels dwindling, all of those things can slow down, and that's very important. The same thing happens in your heart
skin.
because estrogen. Well, I'll get to your skin.
Yeah, that's the one that I'm worried about when I look.
The blood vessels in your heart also are not as dilated. They are more susceptible to plaque buildup. And so a lot of things are happening to the body in this window of time. Skin, you talked about, is something not totally completely appreciated. But what happens is the skin is the surface. But under the skin, there are collagen fibers that are keeping the scaffolding in place so that your skin is stretched out and has the youthful look. And the blood flow to your skin keeps that youthful glow. So as these things change, then the blood flow changes, the collagen, the scaffolding underneath the skin begins to go away, and then it begins to show wrinkles because it's not being kept pulled tight. So then what ends up happening is, remember, this little thing here is a bone. And this bone and your jawbone begin to lose calcium, which causes a change in how prominent they are. They pull back. And so just like some people will say their chest falls and they have more of a waistline, their face will fall. And it'll turn from a triangle like this to a triangle like this. It'll go invert. And so the cheeks will drop and so
pyramid.
forth. It'll invert. So this is a lot of what happens with lack of estrogen. But hormonally and mood-wise, these are big things because in a study that was done just in this year and recently, there was a study of 500,000 Fortune 500 women. 250,000 of them were treated for their hot flashes. All of those 500,000 had hot flashes. 250,000 were treated, and 250,000 were not treated. Now, the 250,000 women who were not treated had 1.5 million more doctor's visits for symptoms related to directly or indirectly to hot flashes. So we're talking about a major impact on work productivity, on self-esteem as it's affected by how good you are at work. People want to feel like they do a great job. And their work ability was their likelihood to be absent in the next year. This is a very big thing for women who are at their prime in terms of their intellect, their wisdom, their capacity to impact their knowledge on the company, on the other women in the company. And also, those same women are dealing with their relationships at home. And I feel very, 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 very much want to spread this message. It's all part of what the Estrogen Window book that I'm working on is about, is the empowering of women's knowledge so they can do something about this. Because in the last decade, since the big study on hormones came out, about 1 million less women are in the workplace than were. All the other groups of women are expanding, but not so for that demographic. And they're CEOs, the people who are self-employed in their own businesses, they're nurses, they're all kinds of people. And this is creating a brain drain for women that needs to be recognized and addressed.
And their testosterone levels are going down. That's my secret anti-aging hormone, my book, The Hormone Secret. I love testosterone, and this is that age, 40 to 50, where we just see it in undetectable levels in many women, and that's about your confidence and your fat to muscle ratio. So it all goes downhill, Maish. What are we to do?
Well, particularly for women who have had their ovaries removed. Right now, removal of the ovaries at age 45 or under is not that uncommon. It's a very common thing because we have more and more women taking genetic testing that are worried about getting different kinds of diseases that are estrogen sensitive, so they have their ovaries removed from that. And the ovaries not just making estrogen, it's also making, as you know, testosterone. And we also have more women having hysterectomies. Remember, there's about 600,000 hysterectomies that are taking place every year. And most of the women who have a hysterectomy are under the age of 45. Now, you have to realize that when you have a hysterectomy, even if they leave your ovaries in, that the blood supply has been really impacted. And just like you can have a heart attack when the blood supply to your heart gets compromised, you can have an ovary attack by having the blood supply to your ovaries affected. And so about 70% of women within 3 years or so are going to lose the majority of the estrogen and testosterone production from their ovaries, even if they're left in. And since they have their ovaries in and they're only 45 or thereabouts, they're thinking, what's going on? I got my ovaries. What else is going on with me? So it's very confusing and very important to understand.
You mentioned something that kind of hit home. I mean, we're doing this big piece on conscious capitalism and kind of the movement forward to bring balance to the world, and a lot of it is in the Western woman kind of stepping into her power and kind of bringing balance to this kind of male-dominated, patronizing type of culture that's created this corporation, this corporate culture that is okay with tearing apart the planet and all that. And what you said to me is really, it's kind of an Achilles heel piece, which is the very women who are in those positions that have kind of like matured and come to, the part of their career, the arc of their career where they are the CEOs and the leaders of their ship, all of a sudden have this really big kind of issue that is oftentimes untreated and is one of the biggest challenges in their lives, kind of, clouding this era, which to me is a very interesting glimpse at why some of kind of the politics of women in business might have shifted. And if we could fix this, I think we have a very good chance of getting closer to fixing the planet, because we need our women in our workforce to be bringing their ethics and their power and their perspective. And it just kind of seems like this is kind of a flat tire on the journey of life if it goes untreated. So I'd love to hear what kind of nutritional hacks you have, what kind of lifestyle hacks you have up your sleeve for our listeners to kind of step in and really start turning this thing around.
Yeah, just to finish your comment, if I may, or add something to it, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that some of the difficulties that women are facing is hormonal. And the reason I say this is because I think they're unaware of it and feel and don't have the full power that they possess at their disposal. And so that's part of the upside of the hormonal treatment of this window in time, but if not, at least some other kind of a treatment and awareness of it. To answer your question, I think that it's very important that people have good habits, because we are not going to do something spontaneously on a regular basis. Otherwise, it wouldn't be spontaneous. So there has to be habits. There has to be a built-in exercise that's taking place 4 or 5 times a week. In terms of nutrition, I think it's very simplistically stated. I would say the elimination of all the processed foods, trying to eat whole foods the best that you can, trying to not eat out as much in restaurants and try and fix your own meals, because there's so much extra salt and sugar and other things when we go out to eat because they want it to taste good. And sometimes what makes it taste good is an acquired taste. We've acquired unhealthy tastes. And so just cooking your own meal can have a big positive impact. I think that women would do well to take a multivitamin. There's a big need for folic acid. Of the vitamins, there was a recent study that came out in the last month that showed things that could be helpful in eliminating or reducing the risk of Alzheimer's that are studied. And the things are folic acid, vitamin C, vitamin E, and caffeine, interestingly. Exercise is probably the one thing that has been shown to categorically as a lifestyle activity to lower the risk of Alzheimer's. And remember, the number of people are going to be having Alzheimer's. Right now, if you're 70 years old, 1 in 7 people have Alzheimer's right now. At 70 and over. 70 and over, 1 in 7 people. And that's going to triple by 2050. This is a drain beyond anything anybody can imagine. And actually, estrogen is the number one drug that lowers that in this study in women. And number 2 is antihypertensive, keeping your cholesterol, the lipids lowering medicines, and the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Those are the 4 things in this study. They looked at 1,600 studies and looked at it and analyzed what worked and what didn't based on a really consensus of a lot of top people. So there's things that people can do: controlling your blood pressure, controlling your blood sugar, your exits, limiting the amount of sugar, limiting the amount of salt. I mean, these are all things that have to be habits that you do. I mean, we could talk about it, but there really has to be a methodical intention to make that happen. Otherwise, we just succumb. The easy way is like whatever is on our plates, and we will be, unfortunately, surprised in a negative way.
Yeah. You know, I think that what people don't realize is that it's not that hard. One of my favorite studies is the Wonder Woman study, where they showed that if women stood in a Wonder Woman pose for 2 minutes, their testosterone levels increased over 20%. Like, you know, before you have a meeting or before you speak or before an interview, there are things that you can hack into your life that are easy and actually work. So it doesn't have to be this, oh my gosh, I have to change my whole diet. Just start. Just start with one thing.
Love that. Doc, I know you got a book coming out, and we're running out of time, so I just want to make sure that people can find you. So can you give us a website where people can find your stuff?
Sure. If people are interested in the just general information, if they go to freemenopauseebook.com, they can get just a general overview of that point of life, freemenopauseebook.com. And my book is called The Estrogen Window. It will be out from Rodale in April of 2016. And that would be a good place to start. If you want to know about an overview of menopause and estrogen and what it does, then there's a third website I will tell you, or the second one is called menopauseBreakthrough.com, and you can go to that and hear a webinar about this whole story.
Dr. Maish, we love you. We think you're a gentleman and a scholar and a great doctor, and thank you for your contribution to society. You've been an inspiration to me, and I know Tammy loves you dearly, so thank you so much for your time and spending it with us here.
It's an honor to join you. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you have a wonderful day.